Mark 2 gives us a day in the life of Jesus. And his day begins, we can infer, with maybe a moment of Sabbath rest. If you remember from last week in Mark 1, we heard about a series of healings, one after the other. And twice when Jesus tried to get away from the crowds, and the text says he was hunted down. They wanted to find him because people wanted healing. Today we learn at the beginning of chapter 2 that Jesus has gone to Capernaum and he is at home. We don't know how many precious moments he had at home by himself before the crowds started showing up that morning, but showing up they did. The house he was in began to get very crowded, and we read that there is a paralyzed man who is lowered down through the roof by his friends. The friends realize they can't get their man into the house to see Jesus in a conventional way, and so they get creative. And Jesus can't help but see this man and see the faith and determination of his friends. And in the middle of his teaching, this crowded home full of people, Jesus stops what he is doing. Similar to how he stopped in the middle of a meal that he was sharing with his disciples on the night before he was to be handed over to suffering and death, and broke bread and poured wine and reminded his friends their sins were forgiven. Similarly, here, Jesus stops what he is doing in this home and says to the man, "Your sins are forgiven." Jesus shares with the paralyzed man what is already true, that God has already forgiven his sins. And we don't really know why, but Jesus is choosing to focus here on his relational and spiritual needs first, before ever addressing his physical needs. It seems that Jesus sees more than just what others see. I have a feeling this man was used to everyone seeing his paralysis first, but Jesus sees the needs below the surface. Jesus sees that he needed a word of forgiveness and restoration and transformation. And don't we all? We all have those moments in our life where we wonder, are we okay in the sight of God? Am I worthy enough? Am I doing enough? Will God ever forgive me? Now, to be clear, there's no indication at all in this text that Jesus is saying your sins are forgiven because he thinks the man's sins have caused this paralysis. That's not the case here. We're just told that Jesus addresses this very human spiritual need that we all have, to be seen for who we are, and not for all that we have done or left undone, for good or for ill. The scribes do not understand this proclamation of forgiveness, so they start kind of stewing in their hearts, and we can assume maybe that they're talking among themselves. And in this moment, we start to get this switch from this wonderful man who is healing to one who becomes to be a little bit controversial. Jesus goes from being the magical miracle man that everyone wants to get a piece of to a man that the religious authorities begin to question. Now, scribes and Pharisees, they get a bad rap often, but really, they're not such bad people, right? Scribes are professionals trained in the interpretation of Jewish law. They basically live and breathe the legality of things. We have some of those folks among us, lawyers, people who are very good, being very attentive to detail, and we need those folks in our midst. Then there's also the Pharisees, and the Pharisees led a lay reform movement within Judaism. And they were concerned, and rightly so, with preserving the Jewish faith and way of life in the midst of Roman occupation. And they took very seriously their faith, and they wanted to renew the faith of their people by applying biblical laws, especially things concerning ritual purity, to all Jews, not just to priests, and to all aspects of daily life, not just temple worship. And they paid special attention to things like dietary laws and Sabbath observance. They worried about losing their culture and religion in the midst of Roman occupation. And while scribes and Pharisees valued debate about the interpretation of law, in general, their opinions were formed based on the weight of precedent and tradition. And so Jesus troubles them because Jesus is speaking and acting with his own authority, seemingly to them without deference to tradition. They view him as a threat to the religious and social order. They don't yet understand him, and they fear him, I think. And what he's saying, it causes them to be uncertain. What he's doing and saying is unfamiliar to them at best and outright blasphemous at worst. To their credit, I think they're just trying to protect the people against random leaders who might go around pretending they are God, right, and can do whatever they want without consulting others. But when protection and fear are motivating drivers, I think we all have to be wary that we don't have blinders on for how God might be doing a new thing in our midst. It's a very fine line to balance fear and that sense of protection and preservation with faith and allowing ourselves to have imagination and innovation. And at this point, they don't know which this Jesus guy is espousing, right? They say, who can forgive sins but God alone? In other words, who do you think you are, Jesus? Now, Jesus, being Jesus, perceives that the scribes are sort of stewing in their hearts or maybe amongst themselves and wants to address this quickly and swiftly. And so in order to prove God's power, I think not his own, he asked the paralyzed man to take up his mat and walk, and the man does. And everyone is amazed. But I think the scribes still wonder if they can trust him. After all, the forgiveness of sins is given by God alone and needs to be granted by the proper channels. Channels like visiting the priests and offering appropriate sacrifices. That is how sins are forgiven, not in a home by a random man on a spur-of-the-moment decision. So, because of that decision and that moment, Jesus' day is off to a controversial start. And the man on the mat, his day is off to a stellar start, right? He is transformed spiritually and physically, and he picks up his mat and he walks out. Now, remember this man and his mat, because we're going to come back to him in a moment. Mark continues the story of Jesus' day by surprising us with yet another controversial decision by Jesus. Jesus needs some fresh air. He goes out and he's teaching and walking by the sea, and he passes a tax collecting booth and sees the man in it, Levi, and calls him and says, "Follow me." And Levi leaves his booth and follows Jesus. It actually seems like Jesus ends up following Levi, though, because he ends up in Levi's home for dinner with other tax collectors, maybe friends and colleagues of Levi. And this time, it was the Pharisees who were huddling and talking off to the side. Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? And it is a wonder, this whole tax collector thing. I mean, doesn't it make sense that Jesus would want to help a man who is paralyzed? We would all want to have compassion on somebody like that who is suffering. But tax collectors, I mean, these guys were the haves, not the have-nots. This is not the beggar on the street in need of help. This is the guy taking advantage of the beggar on the street. The way in which the tax collecting system worked is that Rome would employ local Jews to collect taxes, and as long as they got paid what they needed, they really didn't care how much money the collectors got, and so they could charge more and skim off the top whatever they needed for their well-being and also just, to build up wealth. There was no IRS, no regulations, no holding anyone accountable. It was just subjective, and it was a very lucrative career that preyed on the vulnerabilities, not just of the poor, but on all in society. And Jesus goes for that guy. If Jesus came today and was calling disciples, like the Pharisees, we too might be kind of miffed as the fine people of Calvary Baptist Church of Denver if Jesus just passed us up and instead asked the folks making headlines for financial and political scandals to be his followers instead. I mean, this text is shocking and controversial because Jesus is moving toward the people that we really want to push against. And once again, Jesus overhears this discussion. They're not confronting him directly, and he just says, look, those who are well don't need a doctor, but those who are sick do. I've come to call the righteous, not call the righteous, but to call sinners. And I think he says this because Jesus has already showed himself to be a great physician for the physically and mentally ill, and now he is essentially saying that there are social ills that need healing too. And the way, perhaps, that you heal those social ills is by befriending and calling and guiding and eating with and talking with and getting to know these folks, not further excluding or outcasting or pointing fingers. Then, of course, a whole discussion about fasting ensues, and people, the proverbial people with quotes, we don't know who these people are, but they get upset. And they even use Jesus' relative, John, kind of against him, saying that, well, John's disciples are fasting, so why aren't your disciples fasting? And Jesus tells a short story saying, well, when the couple comes into the wedding reception, that's when all the guests eat, right? That's when you can cut the cake. That's when the party starts. And Jesus is saying, look, I'm the bridegroom here, and I'm not going to be here for long. Now is the time for feasting, not fasting. They must have had looks on their faces like blank stares of non-understanding, because Jesus goes and gives two more little examples to explain what he means. One is about using a new piece of cloth to patch up an old torn piece of clothing, and it's not working, right? It'll tear. And then the other example is about putting new wine into old wineskins, and that also doesn't work. The skins will burst. What these follow-up stories make clear is that one of the issues in this text, one of the disputes and the controversies that it seems like Jesus is helping us wrestle with, is this relationship between the old and the new, the past and the future, time-honored ways and uncharted territory. But this is key, right? The little parables about the old cloak and the seasoned wineskin don't make value judgments, right? They don't suggest that old things are bad and new things are good. Rather, he just sort of highlights that sometimes those things don't go together. And if they do, they could be, ready for destruction, right? That's what happens when you put a new piece of cloth on an old tear. It will rip. That's what happens when you put new wineskins in old wineskin containers. They burst. And so there is this complexity, Jesus is saying, that it's not that these inherited things are bad and the new things are good. Rather, these things can be mutually valuable. They can also be mutually destructive. And how that happens, well, that's something that we have to wrestle with as a community. And this concern for the relationship between the old and the new, I think, gives us a lens to kind of look back at the story at the beginning. This healing of this paralytic man and his mat. I read a commentary this week that really talked about how much this mat is emphasized in this story and why. First, we're told that the man is lowered down through the roof on his mat. The mat is the thing that actually bears this man to Jesus. And Jesus specifically includes the mat in the question he poses to the scribes. He doesn't just ask if it's easier to tell the man that his sins are forgiven and to get up and walk. He says, no, to get up and take your mat and walk. And then he reiterates it again, saying, man, stand up, take your mat, and go home. This mat gets a lot of airtime. And it seems like a weird thing to tell somebody who's been healed to do, right? Make sure you take your hospital bed with you on your way out, right? Make sure you take your old, dirty, smelly cast with you on your way home that you just got cut off your arm. Why does he need to lug the mat around? Well, we don't really know. Maybe it's to show that the paralytic man is so healed that he can not only walk, he can also pick up his mat. Maybe it's a recognition that he still has to sleep and he's going to need something to sleep on. Maybe it's pragmatic. This is a crowded room, there are a lot of people, and your mat does not smell good. Please take it with you on your way out. Thank you very much. Maybe, though, there is more. Maybe Jesus knew that the man's life was never going to be the same again, and he might need to remember at some point what he had been through in the past. That his old life is gone and a new life has begun, but take your mat with you, Jesus says. Don't forget where you came from. Remember your story. Maybe that's a point to consider. Maybe it's a point to remember that, you know what, just because you can walk today doesn't mean you'll be able to walk tomorrow. Kind of like our health insurance, right? We know that we're going to need to use it again in the future at some point. It's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when. Maybe it's a reminder that this physical healing is just one part for this man, but he has been spiritually healed as well. Now, on the other hand, just as the man is called to take up his mat with him and take it with him, Jesus, when he calls the tax collector, Levi, well, Levi has to leave the tax collecting booth completely behind to follow Jesus. And from this point on, we can presume that as a disciple of Jesus, he's so busy he doesn't have time to hang out in the tax collecting booth anymore. That he is literally stepping completely away from his old life and into something completely new. And so we have these two examples, right? One that's a pretty clear-cut, leaving something behind, leaving the tax collector booth behind, stepping into a new life with Jesus. And this other example of a man on a mat who's been paralyzed and can now walk, but Jesus is saying, well, take your mat with you. I wonder how this invites us to see differently and to think differently about our lives. We are so tempted, I think, to break things down into dichotomies of old and new. Does God have a call on my life that is inviting me to leave something behind and go towards something? How often do we ask, does God have a call on my life maybe to continue doing what I'm doing, but just to tweak it or think about it differently, or to take part of that with me, but to go slightly in a new direction? Not a full 360, but maybe just a 180. Jesus is perhaps inviting us here to think about the old and new in not such black and white terms. Are there things in your life that need tweaking and changing, but are perhaps still really important for you as you grow in your faith? Paralyzed man with the mat. Maybe you need to take part of something from your past with you into the future. Or like Levi, are there times in your life, maybe now, when you need to leave something completely behind and to go in a new direction? When do we take the time to fix the old cloak with fabric that won't rip it? And when do we just let it be ripped and stay in the closet and buy a new coat? When do we let old wineskins sit in the pantry unused for a while until we have something we can pour into them? And when do we buy new wineskins because what we have to pour into them requires a new container? Are we awake and aware enough to know the difference for which time it is in our life? These are the questions of life. They're not questions that I can answer for you. And if Jesus was sitting here today, I don't think he would answer them for you either. What this day in the life of Jesus shows us is that he likes to answer questions with stories. That he likes to point to truths, not just proclaim them. That he is stirring and mixing in people's lives in ways that cause discomfort, but that ultimately bring clarity for what it means to live in this kingdom of God that is come near, as he says in Mark 1. The spiritual life, the life following Jesus, is not easy. It requires thought and community and getting out of our comfort zones. It even requires asking hard questions, like the scribes and the Pharisees. But if we ask the hard questions, if we're skeptical about something or someone, are we willing to listen to their answer and to truly see if there is wisdom there? Are we willing to take in some of the wisdom of others along with our own thinking and come up perhaps with something new and creative? This day in the life of Jesus is a day of retreating and teaching, healing and calling, eating and inviting and inquiring. And really, it's just a day that is grounded in ordinary moments where Jesus is trying to remind us all of a timeless truth of God's love. But he's doing it in a new way by pushing us to cross divides, to go over boundaries that we thought were there, and to see things differently.